If we haven't met, my name is Brady. I'm an imperfect follower of Jesus. And just as Chris said, that's what we are. We're just a group of imperfect people trying to follow Jesus the best that we can as a community, being with Jesus, becoming like Jesus, and partnering with Him. Now, we are in the story of the Bible. If you haven't been with us, we're in, since, back in September, maybe October, I don't remember when we started, but the story of the entire Bible. And the story matters. It matters where you're at in the story. So I want to start at the beginning, and we do this every single week, and I know I'm starting to sound like a broken record, but vinyl's cool, so it's fine. So here's the deal. The story begins in the story about someone. Who is the story about? God. And what is He doing? He's creating heaven and earth to be united under the rule of God and humans together. Now, what's amazing to me is that's looking at the story of the Bible through the lens of Genesis chapter 1. But if you follow the story throughout the entirety of the Bible, it's the exact same story because you get to the last two chapters of the Bible, Revelation 21 and 22, and what do you see? Heaven and earth being united under the rule of God and humans together. And you think, maybe the writer of Genesis was onto something, right? Because that's the story of the entire Bible. Now, we all know that it doesn't go very well. So 3 chapters into the Bible, humans who are supposed to partner with God and rule with God say no. And at the 2 trees, right? At the 2 trees, they make a pitiful decision, right? They say, God, we don't want you to define good and evil for us. We don't want to listen to you defining good and evil and live accordingly. We instead want to redefine good and evil according to what's best for us. Now, it may not work out well for other people, but what's best for me, I want to redefine good and evil as. And I don't know if you can relate, but I can relate. We continue to do this. And so they rebelled against God. So we see this separation of heaven and earth. And so the rest of the story of the Hebrew Bible, or what we would call the Old Testament, is the story of this person, this one person who's going to come someday, sometime, and this person's going to do what Adam and Eve couldn't do. They're going to pass the test at the 2 trees. They're going to conquer sin and death. They're going to do what Abraham couldn't do, what David couldn't do, what Moses couldn't do. They're going to reunite heaven and earth under the rule of God and humans together. And so when we get to the New Testament, there are 4 different books at the very beginning of the New Testament, and we call them the Gospels, or the Good News, and it's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And these writers say, hey, everyone, we know who this person is that had been prophesied over and over, who's going to do all of those things, who's going to reunite heaven and earth. It's Jesus. And the way that John says it, he says it really clearly in John chapter 20, verse 30. He says this, now, Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, but these particular signs, these ones have been recorded. I wrote these ones down so that we may believe that Jesus is in fact the Messiah. Now, in your Bible, it may say Christ. That's just the Greek translation of the Hebrew word Messiah, which means anointed king. It's that promised one who was going to come and redeem and restore all things. That Jesus is the Messiah, but not just the Messiah, that he's also, who? The Son of God. And that by believing, we might have life in his name. I love what John does. He says, hey, it's not just the Messiah was going to be a human, it's that the Messiah is going to be God. And so Jesus doesn't just reveal, the best humans can offer. Jesus reveals what God is like. And so at chapter 1, John really begins to show us, hey, Jesus is revealing what God is like. He is the most full picture that we have of God. If you want to know what God is like, he's like Jesus. And that's the question on all of our hearts and minds is, if there is a God, what is he like? And what is his disposition towards me? Someone who is imperfect, who's a sinner, who has rebelled against him. How is he going to treat me? How does he look at me? How does he feel about me? What does he think about me? And we see it so beautifully portrayed in the life of Jesus in the book of John. And today, we're going to have one of those moments where Jesus, again, reveals what God is like, and it's very contrary to the way that we might think, especially in regards to power. What does someone who has all authority in heaven and earth do? What is he like? What does someone do when he has a lot of power? And it's very different than what we do with power. And power in our world has a lot to do with fear. And we're going to see that jump out at us in the story today. Now, I don't know how many of y'all, think about fear in the way that I do, but I get startled really easily. Does anyone else get startled really easily? Oh man, I could be seriously in a crowded room and someone tap me on the shoulder and I jump. I don't know why. I don't like this about me, but I also love to scare people. I know it's strange. I don't like to get scared, but I like to scare people. I don't know why. And there's this person in our office who he's basically the opposite of me. He's like super manly. It's Chris. He's great. You're like, Chris, I love it. He comes here to welcome me. He's like, hello, my name is Chris. I'm like, oh, I need that deep voice. I need that deep voice. But you know what else is great about Chris? Well, it's not great, but it is. He's like all the things on it. He works outside. He's got horses. He's got a farm. It's just incredible. And then he doesn't get scared. I do this. I do. I sneak up on him in the office. And, when he's not looking, I'll try and sneak up behind him. And then I'll like grab him and like yell. And he makes zero reaction. He's basically the bravest person that I know. Right? And I want to be that, but I can't because I get super startled. But I don't. It's not my fault. It's my mom's fault. Okay, my mom also gets startled really easy and loves to startle people. One time, she was head of the booster club for the Branson High School football team, and so they got this giant, I don't know if it was filled with air, if it was stuffed, but this giant, like 7-foot-tall football player. And it looked like this big old football player. And so she didn't know what to do with it, so she put it in the closet in the laundry room. And because she has a big closet in the laundry room, so she put it in there and she shut the door and then she started to do some laundry. And about 15 seconds later, she thought, oh, I need to get some detergent from the laundry room. Opened the closet door and scared herself. And she had just put it in there and she scared herself. And she starts laughing at herself so hard and she thinks, I need to do this to other people. So she starts calling all of her friends and asking them to come over and then saying, oh, hey, I can't reach the thing on the shelf. Can you get that for me? And they open the door and they scare themselves and she just cracks herself up. Like, it's just my mom. It's the way that it is. I remember I was in college and I've got this buddy that I grew up with and he also gets startled very easily. But he reacts extremely differently than me. See, you can react a number of different ways when you get scared. Some people scream. Me. Some people, run. Some people fight. And this is his reaction. And I don't know why I didn't learn my lesson the first time, but I would hide in his apartment, and when he came by, I would jump out and scare him, and he would grab me, and he would start to swing at me, and then he'd realize it was me. And so he'd stop. And I almost got punched in the face probably 10 times before I learned, hey, don't scare him. That's dangerous for you. But the funny thing is I would scare him, and then he would go to punch me, and then he would scare me. So basically, I was just scaring myself. And I was like, you're an idiot. What are you doing? Stop doing that. Like, learn from your mistakes. I don't, but, it's fine. But see, that's the funny side of fear, right? When you watch montages of people jumping out and scaring people and people, getting frightened, and that's kind of funny because there's no real danger in that. But fear is a really powerful thing in our lives. And it can lead us to act or it can lead us to not act. And today in this passage, we're going to see that play out. But I want to tell you guys a story of something that probably you guys are mostly all familiar with. It's something that happened 2 weeks ago. It made all kind of news. In fact, it sadly overwhelmed the news of what's going on in Ukraine. But it was the news of the slap heard around the world. You guys know what I'm talking about with Will Smith, his wife Jada Pinkett Smith, and with Chris Rock. What happened, if you're not familiar, and if you're not missing anything, but Chris Rock was presenting an award at the Oscars, and he made a really awful joke about Will Smith's wife, about Jada. And it's hard to know what exactly happened, but it seems like right at first, Will Smith didn't really react poorly, but then he looked over at his wife, and she obviously reacted poorly because that hurt. And so something stirred up in him, and he got up, went up, and just slapped Chris Rock in the face, and then started yelling at him. Now, I don't tell you this story so that we can judge either one of these guys because I can relate to both of them. I mean, I've said things that I super regret that have hurt people, and I've done things, out of anger that I also regret. But someone pointed me to Will Smith's autobiography, and what he writes in here it sheds a lot of light, and it really, I think, will help us understand what's going on in the passage today. So in the very first chapter, the first couple paragraphs of his autobiography, here's what Will Smith writes. He says this: "I've always thought of myself as a coward. Most of my memories of my childhood involved me being afraid in some way. Afraid of other kids, afraid of being hurt or embarrassed, afraid of being seen as weak. But mostly, I was afraid of my father. When I was 9 years old, I watched my father punch my mother in the side of her head so hard that she collapsed. I saw her spit blood. That moment in that bedroom, probably more than any other moment in my life, has defined who I am today. Within everything that I have done since then, the awards and accolades, the spotlights, the attention, the characters and the laughs, there's been a subtle string of apologies to my mother for my inaction that day, for failing her in that moment, for failing to stand up to my father, for being a coward." What you have come to understand is Will Smith, the alien annihilating MC, the bigger-than-life movie star, is largely a construction, a carefully crafted and honed character designed to protect myself, to hide myself from the world, to hide the coward. Man, when you see that, and you look back at what he did, you see it. You see the moment where he realizes the coward inside and that he needs to do something big to demonstrate that I'm not a coward. And I think, oh, whoa, that's me. Still, until I really looked into and was studying and meditating on this passage, I didn't think fear was a big thing for me. I didn't think cowardice was. But as I looked at that and I read this part in his biography, it really shined a light on so much of my life and so many things that I have not done because I was afraid, and so many things that I have done to not let anyone else know that I was afraid. And we see this really well in the lives of a number of different people who interact with Jesus. So if you want to, grab your Bibles. If you've got your Gospel of John journal, grab that. If you've got a Bible app on your phone, grab that. We're going to be in John chapter 18 and John chapter 19. And in John chapter 18, it's just after the Last Supper. Last week, Chris preached 3 different chapters. Incredible, amazing, that much material. And ended with this prayer that Jesus prayed for his disciples and then also for us, for our unity. And it says this, John chapter 18, verse 1, "When Jesus had spoken these words," so these are the words that Jesus has just spoken, "he went out with his disciples across the brook Kidron, where there was a garden which he and his disciples entered." Now, that's the Garden of Gethsemane. They went out of the upper room, went down out of the gates of Jerusalem, down across the Kidron Valley, and then up onto the Mount of Olives in this garden. Now, Judas, who betrayed Jesus, also knew the place, for Jesus often met there with his disciples. So Judas, having procured a band of soldiers and some officers from the chief priests and the Pharisees, went there with lanterns and torches and weapons. Now, there's a lot of stuff going on here. One thing that's really neat, Jennifer and I got to go to Israel about 4 years ago, and we went to the Mount of Olives, and we went to this grove of olive trees. Now, I don't know how much you know about olive trees, but olive trees can live very long. In fact, there was an olive tree there that was over 2,000 years old. It's an olive tree that was there when these things went down. It's like the last living witness we have of what went down, right? This olive tree witnessed the stuff. Now, obviously, it doesn't think and know things, but it was neat to be there, and I don't know, it just connected me in a powerful way to this passage that we find in John and then also the Synoptic Gospels of what happened. But what we see is Jesus goes down with his disciples to pray, but then there's Judas, who betrays Jesus. And he comes with a band of soldiers. And what do the soldiers have? They've got torches and lanterns, which means what time of day was it? Night. And once again, you see this theme in the book of John of the conflict between light and dark. John chapter 1 and throughout, we see these different elements. Right? We see that the darkness has not overcome the light. We see Nicodemus, who was a Pharisee, who didn't understand what was going on with Jesus at the time, was in the dark. We see how this blind man who couldn't see actually saw Jesus far better than the Pharisees who could see. And then right here, you see this coming to its culmination in Judas siding with the side of the dark, having soldiers. And they also bring weapons. Now, why do we have weapons? Some of us have weapons because we want to protect ourselves. But I think the reason that at least weapons were invented were to be able to exercise control over somebody else, to get someone else to do something that you want them to do that they don't want to do, right? And so we take these weapons and we dominate other people with these weapons so that we can exercise our will and our control over them. So you see these people on the side of the dark with torches and lanterns, but also with weapons to get Jesus, to force Jesus to do what he doesn't want to do. At least that's their perception as they go in. Now, verse 4, then Jesus, knowing all that would happen to him. So you see this a couple times throughout the book of John, Jesus kind of knowing the future. Now he knows, hey, this is what's going to happen. I'm going to get arrested. I'm going to get put on trial. I'm going to get spit upon. I'm going to get mocked. I'm going to get beaten. I'm going to get tortured. And I'm going to be crucified to death. He knows this is what's about to happen. And here's how he reacts. He came forward and he said to them, to this band of soldiers, whom do you seek? And they answered him, Jesus of Nazareth. And he said to them, I am he. Now, once again, this is the Greek phrase ego eimi, which is the Greek translation of God's name, Yahweh, the name we just sung. And so Jesus is once again declaring, I am God. It's not just I am Jesus of Nazareth, but I am God. Now, get this. Judas, who was betraying him, was standing with them. And when Jesus said to them, I am he, they drew back and fell to the ground. He spoke his name, I am, and they fell to the ground. Now, I don't know what it was like to be a soldier in that moment, but I would be thinking, hey, this is not going to go well. We're supposed to arrest this guy? All he has to do is speak, and I can't even stand on my feet. Like, this is a big deal. That's real power. That's real power. You know, when you watch all these different superhero movies, I always want to like rate their power. And so you're like, okay, this guy was able to beat up this guy pretty easily, and this guy wasn't. Like, how does this work? But then sometimes in movies, they don't do it real well. Because you've got like Captain America. When he originally fights Loki, it doesn't go real well for Captain America. But then at the end, he's fighting Thanos and standing toe-to-toe with Thanos. And you're like, come on, what's going on here? Like, be accurate in your perception of power, in the way that you portray it. I know that you guys aren't as passionate about it as I am. That's okay. One day you will mature and you will be just as passionate about it as I am. But there's this moment in the first Avengers where Loki is having a conversation with Nick Fury. Now, Loki is the god of mischief. He's the one trying to take over the world in Avengers 1. And Nick Fury is like this ultimate spy, and he's trying to put together the Avengers. But they're having this discussion about power. And Loki's like, I've got so much power. You're like an ant, and I'm like a boot, right? I can crush you. And then it just so happens that, they capture Loki. Now he wants to get captured, and, he's got a plan. But they're having this conversation, and Loki's like, you don't understand what real power is like. And Nick Fury says to him, because he's got him in this prison, he says, well, if real power wants a magazine or something, let me know, and I'll get you one. It's this conversation, what's real power? This right here, that's real power. When you can speak your name and people fall to the ground, that's power. That's the power of the God who spoke the universe into being, right? Who spoke matter into existence. That is real power. What do you do with real power? What do you do with real power? Now, most of the time in our world, we like to protect it. If you've got a little power, now you've got to protect it. And then fear begins to invade your mind. What does Jesus do with his power? Let's see. Verse 7. So he said to them again, whom do you seek? And they said, Jesus of Nazareth. And, being like, you going to say your name again? Like, We seek Jesus of Nazareth, but don't say your name. And Jesus answered, I told you that I'm he. So if you seek me, let these men go. And this was to fulfill the word that he had spoken. Of those whom you have given me, I have lost not one. Jesus, with real power, in the face of the darkness trying to take him with weapons, voluntarily says, take me and leave them alone. He could have just spoken his name again and they fall to the ground. They didn't have any power over Jesus, and yet he willingly submitted himself to that. But then we have this juxtaposition in verse 10. Then Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. Now, I don't know if we should be in awe of Peter's swordsmanship or laugh at it. Like either he's the greatest swordsman ever because he was aiming for the ear and he got it, which would be super impressive, or he was aiming to kill the guy and he only got the ear. I don't know. He had just drinking 4 glasses of wine in the Passover meal, so maybe we'll cut him some slack. But this is what Peter did. Very different than what Jesus did. So Jesus said to Peter, put your sword into its sheath. Shall I not drink the cup that the Father has, what's that word? Given me. Now this is going to come up again. But Jesus says to Peter, there's someone else who's in control. And this is what he's given me to drink. Shall I not drink it? And there's a very different reaction between Jesus and Peter. Now, when you look at what Peter does, it seems pretty courageous. I mean, there's a band of soldiers with weapons, and he pulls out his sword and starts to fight. Now, his buddy Jesus has just spoken his name and they all fell to the ground. So I don't know that Peter feels a lot of threat to his life. I don't know. But on the surface, it seems courageous. So maybe Peter's super courageous. Well, Jesus gets arrested. He gets taken to the high priest's house, and they're putting him on trial. And Peter follows in, and he's now in the courtyard with some other people watching the trial. It says, now, Simon Peter was standing and warming himself. So they said to him, to Simon Peter, wait, you are also not one of his disciples, are you not? And he denied it and said, I'm not. And one of the servants of the high priest, a relative of the man whose ear Peter cut off, asked, wait a second, did I not see you in the garden with him? And Peter again denied it, and at once a rooster crowed. Now, I don't know what all was going on in Peter's heart and mind, but I think we could imagine that there's a big coward inside of Peter, and that sometimes he acts boldly to hide the coward, and sometimes he doesn't act at all because he's afraid to act. And you see both those things happen. Now, we don't want to stand in judgment of Peter once again because, that's me. I'm just as cowardly, if not more. And I'm so thankful that, I'm imagining Peter being with Jesus right now is thankful that his life and his cowardice can be on display so that we can see the juxtaposition between him and Jesus and that we can instead walk in different footsteps. But you see this pattern in Peter's life over and over where he'll do something big and bold and then he'll be afraid. So Jesus comes walking on the water and everyone's terrified in the boat, Peter included. And so Peter says, Jesus, if it's you, let me walk on the water to you. Kind of displaying that, hey, I've got courage. I'm not afraid like these other guys. But then he starts to walk in the wind and the waves and he gets scared and starts to sink. Later on, he is at, they're in Caesarea Philippi at the northern border of Israel, likely at the temple of the god Pan. And Jesus asks them, who do you say I am? And Peter steps up boldly and says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. You're the Messiah. You're the anointed king, which is pretty bold where he's at. It's a big deal. But then Jesus says, yeah, but as the Messiah, I'm going to suffer and die. And I'm imagining Peter sees how that's going to relate to him and says, whoa, that's never going to happen to you, Jesus. And then Jesus at that moment says, get behind me, Satan, because you're a stumbling block to me. Right? He's boldly declaring him the Christ, but wait, but you're not going to die. You're not going to suffer. No. That's no good. And then we have this in the garden. And then you have it later on. He has an interaction with Paul in Antioch where his fear controls the way that he acts. You see this in Peter's life. There's this pattern of these great bold actions that look like courage, but I think are just displays to hide the fear. Doesn't want anyone to know that he's afraid, that he's a coward. And I think, oh, that's me. But Peter's not the only one who's afraid. They take Jesus from the high priest's house to Pilate. Now, Pilate is the governor of Rome. So he is the person, not the governor of Rome, he's the Roman governor of that area. So basically, he's the person with the most power, with the most authority in that region. He's got soldiers, right? He's got authority. The Jewish leaders are under him. And yet, you see Pilate wrestling with fear. In verse 38, it says, Pilate went back outside. Sorry, this is 18, verse 38. Pilate went back outside to the Jews and told them, I don't find any guilt in him. They bring Jesus to Pilate, say, hey, he needs to be killed. Pilate examines him and says, he's not guilty. But you have a custom that I should release one man for you at the Passover. So do you want me to release the king of the Jews? And they cry out again, not this man, but Barabbas. Now, Barabbas was a robber. Now, this Greek word, listes, it can and probably should be translated in this instant more as a revolutionary or an insurrectionist or a freedom fighter. Like, he was someone who would violently oppose those people, Rome in this case, that were ruling over Judea. These are the people that you would crucify, violent insurrectionists. This is Barabbas. And so you've got Jesus or Barabbas, and the Jewish people say, we want the person who violently fights against Rome with weapons versus Jesus. And you see this choice that they make. Now, in chapter 19, verse 6, it says, when the chief priests and the officers saw Jesus, they cried out, crucify him, crucify him. And Pilate said to him, take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him. So does Pilate think he's guilty? No, okay? The Jews answered him, we have a law, and according to that law, he ought to die because he has made himself the Son of God. And when Pilate heard this statement, he was even more afraid. So already Pilate's afraid. He has the most power in that region. He has the most authority in that region. What he says happens, right? And yet, he's afraid of these people who are below him because he's afraid of what they might be able to do to his position of authority. Might they be able to go over his head? And might he lose what he has? So he's afraid. And now when he hears that Jesus is the Son of God, he's even more afraid of what's going on. Like this moment, he can tell this is a big deal. Verse 9, he entered the headquarters again and said to Jesus, where are you from? But Jesus gave him no answer. So Pilate said to him, You will not speak to me? Do you not know that I have authority to release you, and I have authority to crucify you? And Jesus answered him, you would have no authority over me unless it had been given to you from above. Therefore, he who delivered me over to you has the greater sin. From then on, Pilate sought to release him. What was Pilate trying to do? Release Jesus, right? He didn't think he was guilty, and now he wants to release him. This is what Pilate desires to do. But the Jews cried out, if you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. Everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar. And even though Pilate didn't think Jesus was guilty, even though Pilate wanted to release him, he didn't. He submitted to what they wanted, even though he had power over them, because he was afraid. He was afraid what they could do to his position of authority. And so he does what he doesn't think is right, what he doesn't think is good, what he doesn't think is just. And he hands Jesus over to be crucified because fear ruled his heart and his mind. And when I think about the Jewish leaders who they were afraid to lose their position of power, that's why they had Jesus arrested. And I think about Pilate, who's afraid to lose his position of power. This is why he gives Jesus to be crucified. And I think about Peter, and I don't know exactly what he was afraid of, maybe losing his life or maybe losing the little bit of power that he had as kind of the first among the disciples. But you see these men reacting in fear and sometimes making these bold, courageous declarations and sometimes being afraid to do anything at all. my wife and I have a little bitty tiny little dog, Penelope, and her life is ruled by fear. She's afraid of everything. I mean, she's so scared of everything. And so she'll jump up on you, like, pick me up, and then you'll go to pick her up, and she'll be like, I don't know. Pick me up, I don't know. That's scary. Like, everything she does is out of fear. And what it causes her to do is to not act, right? Fear causes her to not be bold, not act. Well, the dog we had before, Annabelle, she was the opposite. She was also ruled by fear, but she would bark really loud at anything. She was afraid of dogs, people, whatever it was. She would put on this big show like, I'm powerful, I've got strength, even though she didn't, because she was afraid. And I think the same thing happens to us. Sometimes out of fear, we do these bold things that seem courageous, but aren't. And sometimes out of fear, we don't act because we're afraid of what will happen. And you see this with Peter, you see this with Pilate, you see this with the Jewish leaders. And what I want to ask is, what did Jesus know that they didn't know? Why was Jesus so radically different in the way that he acted, in the way that he interacted with these people who tried to have power over him, to arrest him, to beat him, to torture him? Like, why were his actions so different? What did he know? And we see, and I love this, we see Peter years later reflecting on all of this. Reflecting on this night. In 1 Peter chapter 2, he says this, for to this you have been called. So we are called to do the same thing that Jesus did. Because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example, so that you might follow in his steps. He, Jesus, committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten. So as these people were arresting him, spitting on him, mocking him, hitting him, punching him, torturing him, he didn't fight back. He didn't yell back. He didn't call them names back. He didn't fight back. He did nothing. What did he do? How was he able to do this? Peter says this, but he continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. Jesus continued to entrust himself to him who judges justly. Fear is a common experience for all of us. We all, to one degree or another, experience fear. But the call as Christians is, how do we act when we feel fear? In cowardice or in bravery? And the difference, as we see in 1 Peter, is in whom we're placing our trust. Is my trust in my sword? Is my trust in my strength? Is my trust in my authority, in my clout, in the respect that I have? What is my trust in? And Jesus was able to submit himself on our behalf to all kinds of horrible stuff because he put his trust in the one who will ultimately, when it matters most, judge justly. Jesus knew something that we forget all the time, that he had a good, loving Father who works all things together for our good and for his glory. And in the end, when the real judgment happens, when it really matters most, he will take care of his own. And so Jesus, with that on his mind, was able to endure all that he endured, having the power to escape, obviously. Having the power to dominate them, obviously. And yet, not using his power for self-preservation, but instead for self-sacrifice for the good of others. I think what we see in this passage is that the solution to fear is fear. I know that sounds strange, but if you look at Proverbs chapter 9, you see that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, which should bring our minds back to the Garden of Eden. And what you have is you have Adam and Eve looking for wisdom. And what Proverbs says, if you begin with the fear of the Lord, you have wisdom. But they didn't begin with the fear of the Lord. They didn't respect God and his authority. They didn't respect God and his choosing what is good and what is evil. they wanted to choose for themselves, so they rebel against God. They sin, and then fear overtakes them, right? Then they hide from God. They're afraid of God. They're terrified by God and what he's going to do to them. But if you begin with the respect and awe and reverence of God, then at the end in the judgment, you don't call to the mountains to hide you from God. When you entrust yourself to him who has all power and authority, to him who judges justly, to him who is good, to God who is your good, loving Father, it changes the way that we experience fear and enables us to act differently. Not out of fear, but out of trust. See, the way of the kingdom of heaven is very different from the way of this world. The way of this world is to use power to dominate and then to use strength to keep your power. And the way of the kingdom is the way of Jesus. It's restraining your power, not using it for self-preservation, but instead giving yourself for the good of others, even if it's going to go poorly for you, and trusting that ultimately God's going to take care of you. Now, you may go through very difficult seasons. You may be tortured. I mean, who knows what's going to happen in the next few years? Right now, we have, great, ability to teach the Word of God and preach the Word of God and not have to worry about violence to ourselves. That's not the way it is for most Christians around the world. But who knows what will happen in the future? There are many believers who have trusted God and suffered horrible deaths, knowing that this life, although suffering is horrible, it's nothing compared to the ultimate judgment. And walking in the footsteps of Jesus, filled with the power of his Spirit, they were able to live and act in bravery rather than cowardice. And that is my hope for me and for all of us. That every single day, when we have these little decisions to make, either out of fear or bravery, that we would begin to practice standing up for people who need to be stood up for, to call out injustice when we see it, to say things that might be unpopular, even though they're right and just and true. As we make little decisions to walk in bravery rather than in fear, when one day we have the decision, the big decision, we will have, by God's power and strength, trained ourselves to be brave. And that's my hope for all of us, to be able to walk in Jesus' footsteps of bravery, submitting his power and giving himself for the good of others.